Have you ever heard a sound so powerful it felt like hope itself had an engine? The kind of sound that cuts through silence, through fear, through injustice, and makes you believe, just for a moment, that good still fights back? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to see begins with that sound, the deep, thunderous echo of motorcycles rolling down a forgotten road in small-town America. It's early morning. Mist curls over a quiet neighborhood that time seems to have forgotten. There, at the end of a cracked street, stands an old wooden house, paint faded, porch creaking, and a woman standing still as the world moves against her. Her name is Eleanor Price, 74 years old, born and raised in this very home. To her, this house isn't just wood and nails, it's her story, the smell of her husband's coffee, the laughter of children who've long grown, the sound of rain on a tin roof that once felt like music. But today, there's no music, just the low growl of heavy machines. Bulldozers lined up like predators, men in suits talking about development, modernization, progress. Words that sound noble but hide something rotten underneath. Greed. You can see it in their eyes, the way they look at the land as if it were a prize, not a life. Eleanor clutches a letter in her trembling hands, an eviction notice. Her voice cracks as she whispers to no one, "My husband built this house with his own hands. You can't just take it." But no one listens. Cars drive by, neighbors peek through blinds, afraid to get involved. It's the kind of moment that breaks your faith in humanity. Have you ever been through something like that, watching someone's world fall apart while everyone else looks away? And yet, that's when it happens, the moment that changes everything. A distant rumble begins to rise, faint at first, then stronger. It's not the bulldozers this time. It's different, heavier, human. Alive, the sound of motorcycles. Approaching, the kind that makes windows vibrate and hearts skip a beat. The men in suits pause, annoyed. The construction workers look up from their machines. And Eleanor, still standing on her porch, wipes her tears, not yet understanding what's coming. Out of the morning fog appears a single biker, black jacket, dust on his boots, a scar across his cheek. His name is Jack Monroe. To most, he looks like trouble, rough, dangerous, someone you cross the street to avoid. But to those who know the road, men like Jack are something else entirely. They're the ones who've seen darkness and still carry light, the ones who've lost everything but never forgot what it means to stand for what's right. Jack slows his bike, kills the engine, and looks at the scene, the bulldozers, the tears, the indifference. Something inside him stirs, something he thought he'd buried long ago. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's guilt, or maybe it's the simple truth that a person can only look away from injustice for so long before they have to act. He takes off his helmet, walks up the dirt road. The men in suits stop talking. Eleanor looks at him, confused, scared, yet oddly hopeful. Jack doesn't say much, just studies the eviction notice in her hands. The silence between them says more than words ever could, and in that silence, a promise is born. What happens next isn't just about one house or one woman. It's about justice, compassion, and the kind of loyalty that still exists in unexpected hearts. Because sometimes the loudest hearts really do beat under the roughest leather. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. This is where the real story begins. If you've ever felt that lump in your throat while watching someone face injustice alone, you know exactly what Eleanor felt on that porch, and what Jack saw when he stopped his bike. Moments like this remind us that compassion is a choice, and sometimes it's the only thing that keeps humanity alive on the darkest roads. If this story is already reaching you somehow, leave a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Was it the silence of the neighbors? The moment the engine started to roar in the distance? Or maybe it brought back a memory of your own, a time when you wished someone would have stepped forward. I read every comment, and your voice is what turns these stories into something real, something shared. And if you believe the world still needs stories like this, stories of justice, redemption, and heart, then give this video a like. It might seem like a small gesture, but it's the fuel that keeps this channel moving forward, helping more people find the kind of content that reminds us we're not alone in caring. If you're new here, or if you've been quietly watching for a while, consider subscribing. That's how we keep this road alive. One story, one heartbeat, one act of courage at a time. Every new subscriber is part of this movement that refuses to give up on empathy, even when the world feels cold. So stay with me, because the road ahead is just beginning, and what happens next will show just how far compassion can go when it rides beside courage. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving behind only the faint hum of cicadas and the slow creak of Eleanor's porch swing, moving in the wind. For a moment, everything felt still, too still, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. The horizon shimmered under the heat, and from the far end of the road came a different kind of engine, polished, silent, expensive. Two black SUVs rolled in like sharks, gliding through calm water. Their windows reflected the house, the fields, the old oak tree that had stood there for nearly a century, reflections of everything they were about to erase. When the first car door opened, the scent of cologne and new leather replaced the smell of dust and grass. A tall man in a navy suit stepped out, sunglasses hiding eyes that didn't need to. See to judge. His name was Mr. Coleman, the kind of man who talked about the future as if it were his personal property. Beside him, Blake, younger, sharper, carrying a tablet instead of a heart, scanned the area like a predator measuring distance to its prey. They didn't greet Eleanor. They didn't even look at her at first. Their gaze went straight to the land, the wide backyard, the orchard behind the barn, the slope leading down to the creek. Numbers. That's all they saw. Not history, not love, just numbers on a future development report. "This is the last one standing?" Coleman asked, his tone casual, detached. Blake nodded, scrolling through a document on his screen. "Yes, sir. The old lady refused relocation. We've got the demolition crew scheduled for this afternoon. Once it's cleared, we can start laying foundation before the rains." Eleanor gripped the railing of the porch to keep her balance. Her voice trembled, but she forced it out anyway. "This was my husband's home. He built this porch with his own hands after coming back from the war. You can't just take it." Coleman finally turned toward her, removing his sunglasses. His smile was polite, practiced, and utterly hollow. "Ma'am, no one's taking anything. We're compensating. Progress can be difficult to accept, but you'll find peace once you move on. The world keeps spinning, whether we hold on or not." "Peace?" she repeated, her tone breaking between disbelief and heartbreak. "You call it peace when you tear down the last piece of someone's life?" He sighed, glancing at his watch. "Emotions make things complicated. Let's not do that today." In that instant, something inside Eleanor cracked. Not with rage, but with a quiet realization that she was invisible to them. She wasn't a person anymore, just an obstacle on a project timeline. Behind the suits and the polished smiles was the same truth that has shaped every cruel decision in history. The world moves faster when you stop caring about who it runs over. Coleman signaled to the foreman waiting by the bulldozer. The man nodded, started the engine, and the ground began to tremble. The sound was low, mechanical, inevitable, the noise of a future that doesn't ask for permission. Eleanor's heart pounded. She stepped forward, raising her voice above the growl of machinery. "Please, just give me one more day. My husband's medals are still inside." But Coleman didn't answer. He turned his back and began discussing building permits with Blake. It was like watching two architects redesign the world while pretending the wreckage wasn't real. And yet, beneath all that noise, there was something else happening. Something subtle, almost hidden. The rhythm of another engine, distant but steady, cutting through the air like a pulse. Not a bulldozer, not a car, a motorcycle. That low, human growl returning, closer this time, slower, deliberate. Jack Monroe was coming back. From down the road he saw it all. The men in suits, the dust, clouds rising, the woman standing on the porch with her hands shaking. The scene looked like a memory he'd spent years trying to forget. He'd seen it before, not in this town, not with this woman, but in another place where the innocent lost everything while the powerful smiled and walked away. Back then, he did nothing. Back then, he told himself it wasn't his fight. But some ghosts never stop following you until you finally turn around and face them. He parked at the edge of the gravel road, turned off the engine and took in the scene. One bulldozer, 2 SUVs, a small army of construction workers waiting for orders, and one woman, old, fragile yet somehow unbroken, standing her ground. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her story before she even spoke. It was the same story the world keeps writing, over and over again, every time decency gets crushed under the boots of greed. He took off his helmet, his jaw tightening as he walked closer. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, the kind of quiet authority that comes from someone who's been through fire and never forgot the heat. Coleman turned, mildly annoyed. "Private property, sir. I'm afraid this area's off-limits for now." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Off-limits to who?" "The woman who lives here." Coleman smirked. "Lives here, yes. Owns it, no. We've acquired the land through the proper channels. Everything's legal." "Legal doesn't mean right," Jack said, his tone flat, his gaze steady. "I've seen a lot of things that were legal, but broke people just the same." Blake stepped forward, trying to sound authoritative. "Sir, I don't think you understand the situation." Jack cut him off with a look. "Oh, I understand perfectly. I just don't like it." Eleanor stepped down from the porch, her hands trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. "They said I have to leave today, that if I don't, they'll destroy it all." Jack turned to her, his voice softening. "What's your name?" "Ma'am, Eleanor," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Well, Eleanor, I don't think anyone's tearing down anything today." Coleman chuckled, glancing at his watch again, then back at Jack. "And who exactly are you to decide that?" For a moment, silence. Then Jack answered, his voice low and unshaken. "Just someone who's tired of watching people lose their homes to men who think progress means destruction." Coleman's smirk faded. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jack looked him straight in the eye. "Neither do you." The air grew thick, the kind of stillness that hums right before lightning strikes. Workers hesitated near the bulldozer, glancing at one another, uncertain. They didn't know this biker, but something in his stance made them pause, like he'd seen enough storms to know exactly when to step into one. Behind them, the town's wind carried faint echoes, more engines, faint but growing. The sound spread like a secret being passed from one soul to another. The brotherhood was coming, not out of rebellion, not for vengeance, but because sometimes the only way to stop injustice is to stand in front of it. And there, under the wide American sky, between the greed of 2 men and the courage of 1, something powerful began to take shape. Not just resistance, but a reminder that compassion, when ignited, spreads faster than fear. That courage isn't loud until it needs to be, and that even on the quietest roads, the sound of justice always finds its way back. The engines were getting closer now, their echoes bouncing off the hills, growing louder, deeper, until the world that once felt small began to tremble again, this time not from bulldozers, but from hearts beating in unison. And that was when everything began to change. The engines of the bulldozers rumbled like beasts, waiting for permission to destroy, their growl rising and falling in waves that shook the fragile wood beneath Eleanor's porch. Dust floated in the morning air, swirling around her like a storm that had finally reached her doorstep. She sat down slowly on the worn steps, her knees weak, one hand gripping the railing, while the other held a faded photograph pressed against her chest. In that photo, her husband smiled beside her, his arm around her waist, a hammer in his other hand, and the same porch behind them, new, bright, full of life. She ran her thumb across his face, whispering his name under her breath, the sound barely audible over the idle machines. "You promised you'd never let them take it from me," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You promised." Her eyes lifted toward the horizon, where sunlight touched the roof for what might be the last time. Everything around her seemed to hold its breath. The oak tree that had stood watch for decades, the broken fence that leaned like an old friend too tired to stand straight. Even the birds had gone quiet. The world seemed to know something sacred was about to be broken. Down the street, curtains moved as neighbors peeked out, their faces pale and uneasy. They'd heard the arguments for weeks. They'd seen the papers nailed to the door, the officials who came and went, the men in suits who spoke with polite cruelty, but no one stepped forward. Fear makes good people silent. They told themselves it wasn't their fight, that there was nothing they could do. It's a mindset that starts small. One choice, one decision to look away, until you wake up one day and realize you've built an entire world on quiet surrender. Eleanor's hands shook as she tried to stand, the photograph slipping from her grasp. It landed face up on the porch, a thin layer of dust settling over the image of her husband's smile. She bent to pick it up, but her knees gave way. Her voice broke in a prayer that wasn't for a miracle but for strength. "Lord," she whispered, "if you're still listening, I can't do this alone." The bulldozer's engine revved, louder now. The foreman shouted to his crew. The sound was unbearable, mechanical, final, heartless. The vibration crawled up through the ground and into her bones, shaking the picture frame in her hands. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. There's a certain kind of despair that doesn't scream. It just sits quietly inside you, heavy as stone, waiting for someone, anyone, to see it. And then, somewhere between the rumble of the machines and the thudding of her heart, came another sound. Low, steady, human, a single motorcycle engine. Distant at first, but growing closer with every second. It wasn't the rushed sound of passing traffic. It was deliberate, measured, like a heartbeat. Eleanor lifted her head, squinting through the sunlight, unsure if what she heard was real or just the memory of a world that once cared. The bike appeared over the hill, black chrome glinting, dust trailing behind it. The man riding it looked like he'd come from a different time, from a world that no longer fit into this one. His leather jacket was worn, patched with scars and sun-faded symbols that hinted at roads he'd traveled and battles he'd survived. His name was Jack Monroe, though no one in this town knew him yet. To them, he was just another drifter, another stranger with nothing to lose. But life has a strange way of placing the right strangers in the right places when the world begins to lose its balance. Jack slowed down as he approached the house. Something about the sight stopped him cold. The bulldozers, the men standing, around with folded arms, the old woman sitting alone on the porch with her head bowed. It wasn't just sadness he saw, it was defeat, and that hit him like a punch. He knew that feeling too well. He'd seen it before in places the world prefers to forget. The eyes of people who'd lost everything because someone else decided they didn't deserve to keep it. He pulled over to the side of the road, the motorcycle's engine cutting off into silence. The sound left behind an emptiness so deep it felt like the earth was holding its breath again. He removed his helmet slowly, running a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. She didn't look up right away. Her shoulders were hunched, her lips moving in quiet prayer, and something about that image, that fragile defiance, rooted him in place. He remembered another porch years ago, in another town, the day they came for his father's repair shop. Same kind of papers, same kind of words. Progress, development, economic, opportunity. They said it like it meant salvation. But all it really meant was displacement. They tore down everything his father had built, walls covered in grease, memories, laughter. Jack had been a younger man then, hot-headed but powerless, forced to watch the demolition from a distance. He'd told himself that day that he'd never get involved again, that he'd stay out of other people's fights. Yet here he was. The past, it seemed, had followed him home. He walked closer. Dust rose around. His boots. The foreman noticed him first. "Hey, buddy, this is a restricted area," he barked. Jack didn't even glance at him. His eyes were on Eleanor. She finally looked up, startled by the shadow that fell across her. Her voice was frail, but steady. "You shouldn't be here, son. They'll just turn on you too." Jack shook his head, his tone low but certain. "I've seen men like them my whole life. They only win when everyone else walks away." The foreman stepped forward again, his hand waving. "Toward the street. Move along, sir. This isn't your problem." Jack's jaw clenched, the quiet strength in his expression sharper than any words. "Maybe it is." Eleanor's breath caught. For the first time in weeks, someone had said something on her side. Not with pity, not with hesitation, but with conviction. She didn't know who this man was or why he cared, but something about his presence steadied her trembling hands. Around them, the workers shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to interference, especially not from men like him. Bikers had a reputation, loud, unpredictable, dangerous, but there was something different in Jack's stance. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was just standing there, quiet, grounded, unmovable, like the earth itself had decided to draw a line. And that's when something began to change, not in the noise around them, but in the air itself. It's the shift that happens when courage enters a space where fear has been living too long. The energy changes. People start to look at each other differently. Someone whispers, "Maybe we shouldn't be doing this," and that whisper carries farther than orders shouted through a megaphone. Jack bent down, picked up the photo Eleanor had dropped, and brushed the dust off the glass with his glove. "He built this place?" he asked softly. She nodded, tears welling again. "Every inch of it. Said he wanted me to always have a home, no matter what happened." Jack handed it back to her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Then maybe we should make sure he keeps that promise." Behind them, Coleman's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "That's enough. Who are you, some kind of vigilante? You think one man can stop progress?" Jack turned slowly, meeting his gaze. "Progress," he said, the word bitter in his mouth. Funny how that word always seems to mean someone else loses everything. The tension thickened, the bulldozers still idling like hungry animals waiting for a signal. Yet no one moved. Not the workers, not the foreman, not even Coleman, who suddenly seemed less certain of his authority, because sometimes it only takes one person to interrupt the machinery, one soul brave enough to remind everyone that compassion still exists. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but this was the moment her story would stop being one of loss and start becoming one of transformation. The kind of transformation that begins quietly in the smallest act of defiance and ripples outward until it changes everything around it. She looked at Jack, at the way he stood there with his shoulders squared and eyes steady, and for the first time in months she didn't feel alone. In the distance, wind carried a sound that was both faint and unmistakable. Another engine, then another, and another. It was as if the road itself had begun to awaken. Somewhere beyond the curve, beyond the hills and the silence, humanity was preparing to answer a single cry for help. The kind of cry that reminds us what it means to belong to one another, even when the world forgets. Jack let the motorcycle settle into silence, the engine ticking as it cooled, a metallic heartbeat slowing after a sprint. He stood there for a breath, taking in the house. The sun-flared glass in the windows, the bulldozers waiting with their dull patience, and the small figure on the porch steps clutching a frame as if it were a life raft. Gravel crunched under his boots as he walked forward. He didn't posture, didn't puff his chest or throw words at the men in suits. He simply approached the person who mattered most in that scene and lowered his voice to something human. "Ma'am, you okay?" The question landed like water on a brush fire. Not enough to put it out, but enough to cool the edges so a person could breathe again. Eleanor looked up, not quite believing that someone had chosen her over the noise. Her eyes were glassy, the tenderness of a whole lifetime balancing there, ready to spill. "They forged my signature," she said, the words tripping out as if she had repeated them 100 times to people who never cared to hear. "They sent documents with my name on them, said I agreed to sell. I didn't. I never would. I tried the sheriff. He told me there's a process. He told me they have permits. He told me to calm down. Her voice faltered. I can't calm down when they're taking my home. Jack didn't answer right away. Silence can be cruel, but not this kind. This was the stillness of someone actually listening, the kind that gives shape to another person's pain. He studied the papers she showed him. A photocopied signature, stiff and unnatural, pasted into the place where her name belonged. The dates didn't line up. The notary stamp looked like it had been dragged across the page, its ink muddy, the detail wrong. He had seen forged documents before, not in boardrooms but behind gas stations, in the back offices of small-town deals where men with soft hands learned how to break. Lives without getting their boots dirty. His jaw worked. He didn't look at Coleman or Blake. Predators thrive on attention. He focused on Eleanor like she was the only square of ground that mattered. "Tell me everything," he said. She did, because something in his tone made confession feel less like weakness and more like help. She told him about the letters, the phone calls made from blocked numbers, the relocation specialist who promised assistance that never came, the way the sheriff said. His hands were tied because the county needs growth, the casual cruelty of neighbors who said, it's not personal, it's progress. She told him about her husband Daniel, about the nights he stayed up measuring boards twice, because perfection felt like a prayer, about the mindset they shared. Fix it yourself, keep your word, let your yes be yes. When she finished, Jack exhaled through his nose, slow, like a man settling a weight across his shoulders. No one should lose their home like this, he muttered. The words weren't meant to be brave, they were a diagnosis. Eleanor touched the photo frame to the spot over her heart and tried to steady her breath. I tried to do things the right way, she said softly. I thought, if I told the truth would protect me. Jack stared at the crooked notary stamp. Truth protects, he said, but not everyone lets it in the door. Behind them, the bulldozers idled, and the foreman shouted to a driver who pretended not to hear. Coleman whispered something to Blake, who kept tapping his tablet, agitated that time. His God was being disrespected. The morning kept moving around them, but the small circle of ground where Jack and Eleanor stood seemed to slow. It was the kind of pause that happens right before an important decision, the hinge in a story where a person decides whether to carry their wounds like a shield or set them down and do the difficult thing. Jack's silence lengthened. Behind his eyes, a behind-the-scenes reel flickered. A father's shop collapsing into dust, a younger Jack pressing his palms against chain link as machines chewed through a lifetime, a sheriff shrugging with the exact same helpless tilt of the hand. He remembered the moment he chose to walk away, how the decision had seemed like wisdom at the time, self-preservation, dressed up as maturity. He also remembered the impact of that decision, a hidden truth that doesn't stay buried. It burrows into your sleep, gnaws at your choices, turns the road into a long apology you're never brave enough to deliver. I filed complaints, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a little strength from the fact that he hadn't moved. I went to the courthouse. I waited 5 hours, and the clerk said my case number wasn't recognized. They said I must have typed it wrong. I didn't. Then the notice came with today's date. They said if I'm still here by noon, I'll be removed for trespassing. The word trespassing cut deeper than any threat of metal. How do you trespass on your own memories? Jack turned the paper sideways, then upside down, as if a different angle might reveal something new. He knelt on the porch step to be level with her eyes. Eleanor, look at me. She did. You're not crazy, he said, and the relief that flashed across her face was more powerful than any dramatic declaration. They want you to doubt yourself, because doubt makes people tired, and tired people stop fighting. She closed her eyes and nodded, breathing through the weight. I don't want anyone hurt, she said quietly. I just want them to see me. He glanced over his shoulder at the suits who were pretending to talk to each other, pretending not to watch him. They see you, he said. They just don't think they have to care. He stood again, unfolding his spine like someone coming back to height after years of carrying too much. He walked to the edge of the porch and rested a hand on the rail his fingers almost seemed to recognize. Sanded oak, well-oiled, made to last. "What if I talk to them?" he asked. She laughed once, not unkindly, just tired. "They won't listen." He didn't disagree. "Maybe not," he said. "Sometimes the point isn't to make them listen. Sometimes the point is to make them stop." The foreman approached, cautious in the way men are when they sense a different kind of authority than the one printed on a badge. "Sir, we're trying to keep this peaceful," he said. "Then don't touch the house," Jack replied without raising his voice. "We have an order," the foreman said, holding up a clipboard like a shield. Jack tilted his head. "Orders are only as good as the hands that carry them." He turned back to Eleanor. "Do you have the original deed?" She nodded toward the front room. "Top drawer of the old desk," she whispered. "Daniel never loved paperwork, but he loved that deed." He looked at Coleman then, a long, direct look without aggression, the kind of stare that asks if a man is willing to be seen for who he really is when the label is stripped away. Coleman adjusted his cuff, pretending to be bored. Blake kept tapping the screen. Jack walked into the front room with Eleanor's permission, crossing the threshold like a person visiting a chapel. The air smelled faintly of cedar, lemon oil, and the soft, stubborn sweetness of old books. He found the desk, opened the top drawer, and there it was. The deed, edges frayed, paper thick with the authority of a different era. Attached to it were receipts for property taxes, signatures neat as stitches, and a folder of correspondence that made the timeline clearer than sunlight. When he returned, he set the deed gently on the porch rail, next to the forged paperwork. Two narratives, side by side. A true story told over decades and an invented story designed to erase it in a week. "Mindset," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's what this is. They think history is negotiable if the price is right." Eleanor watched him weigh the pages with his eyes. "He used to say the house made him better," she said, voice drifting. "Said if you build something that takes care of someone you love, it changes a man." Jack nodded. "Buildings teach us," he said. "They teach patience. Level, square, plumb, you learn to accept nothing crooked." He didn't mean wood. He meant everything else. A wind lifted and laid the corner of the forged document against the deed, like a hand trying to smother a mouth. Jack pinned both with his palm and looked to the road. The horizon wore a faint shimmer, and the echo he'd heard earlier returned, not loud yet, but certain. Far-off engines stitched a thin thread of sound across the fields, a promise on approach. He didn't smile, didn't call, didn't signal. Things like this aren't orchestrated, they're recognized. A shared code, a way of knowing when a person puts their body where their words are. Behind the suits, a neighbor stepped onto his porch and pretended to water a plant. Another pretended to check her mailbox. They were not ready to be brave, but curiosity is a kind of rehearsal for courage. Jack turned to Eleanor with a small, steady calm. "I can't fix the whole system," he said, "but I can change what happens in front of me." She held his gaze, and for the first time there was something like partnership in it. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want my husband's work to keep standing." "That's not revenge," he said. "That's justice." Coleman finally closed the distance. A tight smile rearranged on his face. "Let's be reasonable," he said, as if he hadn't planned the unreasonable. "We're behind schedule. The market window is narrow. There's significant economic benefit to the county." Jack lifted a hand, not to silence him, but to steady the space. "You can keep your pitch," he said. "This is a home." Blake shifted his weight, trying to regain the narrative. "Sir, we'll compensate beyond fair market value. Think of the transformation this area will undergo. Jobs, tourism, new housing, impact." He said the word like an ad. Jack didn't flinch. "There's a difference between impact and harm," he replied. "You're confusing noise with progress." He faced Eleanor again, letting the suits hover in their impatience. "I need you to tell me something," he said softly. "If they walk away today, what do you do tomorrow?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "I fix the loose step," she said after a beat. "I oil the hinges. I call my son, tell him. It's okay to bring the grandkids this weekend, and I sleep." He absorbed that like a blueprint. "Good," he said, "because when a person starts repairing again, it tells the world the place is alive." The bulldozer clanked forward half a yard as the driver tested the brake, a petty demonstration. Jack didn't look. He kept his body between the machine and the woman as if this were all instinct, as if his bones had made the decision before his mind could catch up. "You ever think you were done with something?" he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, only to find out it was still inside you, waiting. Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Every day since he died." He nodded once. "Same." A hawk wheeled high above the creek, its shadow sliding over the roof like a long, elegant scar. The day stretched, and the faint thread of engines on the horizon braided into a stronger line. The sound carried a different kind of authority, the kind that doesn't need permission to matter. Jack didn't announce it. He let the atmosphere register the change, the way a barometer registers a storm long before the cloud bank is visible. He picked up the deed again and spoke, not to the suits, not to the workers, but to the house. "You've stood through winters," he said softly. "You can stand through this." Coleman checked his watch and tried a new tactic, lowering his voice as if confidential kindness might do what intimidation hadn't. "Look, Mr. Monroe," Jack said without moving his eyes from the page. "Mr. Monroe," Coleman continued, "I respect your passion, I do. But there are decisions made above our heads. My hands are tied." Jack finally met his gaze. "Untie them." The foreman coughed. Workers stared at their boots. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door slapped, and a child asked a mother what was happening, and the mother said, "A man stopped to help," as if she were telling a story she hoped would be true. Jack returned the deed to Eleanor's hands, and in doing so, returned something else that had been slipping, the idea that a person could hold ground by simply refusing to move. He didn't promise outcomes. He granted presence. Behind the steady planes of his face, the old wound reopened, not to bleed, but to breathe. That's how healing begins, not with fireworks, but with oxygen. The engines beyond the hill resolved into separate heartbeats now, 1, 2, 3, then more, the road catching their rhythm and carrying it forward. Jack rolled his shoulders, like a man settling into a familiar weight, and let the air fill with what was coming. He didn't posture or preach. He stood there, the lone hinge between greed and decency, making a choice he had once run from and was now ready to own, as the first distant headlight bent around the curve and washed a soft, certain light across the porch. Jack didn't speak for a long while. The air between the house and the men in suits hung heavy, like the space between lightning and thunder. Coleman kept glancing at his watch, pretending to be in control, but even he could sense the balance shifting. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quieter than that, heavier. Jack's silence carried weight. It was the kind of silence that happens when a man stops running from the part of himself that still remembers what courage feels like. He turned his back to the bulldozers and stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The faint hum of engines beyond the hills had grown stronger, more distinct. He recognized the sound before he even reached for his phone. It was the past coming for him, not to haunt, but to answer. Jack took out his phone, its screen cracked, edges worn from years of miles and mistakes. He stared at it for a moment, thumb hovering over the contacts list, as if pressing that button meant crossing a line he'd drawn long ago. He'd promised himself he was done with that life, with the noise, the chaos, the bruised knuckles and sleepless nights. He'd promised to stay on the quiet side of the road, but some promises are meant to be broken when silence becomes complicity. He dialed. The call connected after the first ring. "It's time," Jack said, voice low, steady. A pause. Then the answer came, a deep laugh that carried the weight of recognition. "You serious, brother?" the voice asked. "Dead serious," Jack replied. "Send the word. We ride." The conversation ended there. No explanations, no questions. Brotherhood didn't need context. It ran on trust and shared scars. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, exhaled through his nose, and looked at the house again. Eleanor was watching him with a mix of fear and disbelief, her trembling hands clutching the deed like scripture. "What did you just do?" she asked, voice shaking. Jack didn't answer right away. He crouched near the porch steps, resting his elbows on his knees. "Something I should have done a long time ago," he said quietly. Across town, the first engine came to life. A low growl echoed inside a dim garage, cluttered with tools, oil-stained rags, and the ghost of old songs. Ray, broad-shouldered with a scar that ran from temple to chin, rolled back the throttle and felt the vibration in his bones. He didn't need to ask why Jack had called. If Jack Monroe was picking up the phone again, something righteous was burning. "You heard the man," he muttered, slipping his jacket on. The patch on the back, Iron Saints MC, caught the light as he stepped into the sun. A few miles away, Doc, the oldest among them, was sitting outside a diner, polishing the chrome on his Harley, when his phone buzzed. He read the message, smiled to himself, and slid the phone into his vest. "Didn't think I'd get this call again," he said under his breath. The waitress, a woman who'd known him for years, raised an eyebrow. "Trouble?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Justice." Further down the interstate, Hawk killed the radio in his garage and stared at the message glowing on the screen. "We ride," it said. Just 2 words, but they were enough. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked toward the row of bikes parked like sentinels. Each one was tuned to perfection, each one a story on wheels. "Guess the quiet life didn't last long," he said with a grin that looked more like a scar healing. And out on the edge of the desert, Tanner, the youngest, still wore the restlessness of a man searching for redemption. He'd joined the Brotherhood years after the rest, a kid who made many wrong decisions before he learned what loyalty really meant. When Jack's call came through, he didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said to no one in particular. "We're not done yet." Back at the house, Jack stood beneath the porch roof, the smell of oil and dust in the air. The men in suits were growing nervous now, whispering among themselves, sensing something they couldn't define. There's a moment in every conflict where the hidden truth rises to the surface, the realization that power isn't about money or paperwork, but about conviction. Coleman stepped forward, his composure cracking. "What are you trying to prove?" he demanded. Jack looked at him with that calm, level stare that unnerved even men who thought they couldn't be touched. "That people still stand for something," he said simply. The road began to hum louder. The sound of engines multiplied, no longer faint or distant. It was like a wave forming. Slow at first, then steady, then unstoppable. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Eleanor clutched her chest, tears spilling over, not from fear this time, but from something deeper, the impact of realizing she wasn't alone anymore. She had spent weeks shouting into a void that never answered, and now the answer was arriving, loud enough to shake the dust off her memories. Jack stepped forward into the road, the sunlight catching the silver streak in his hair. He pulled a pair of worn leather gloves from his back pocket and slipped them on, each motion deliberate, ritualistic. "You should leave," he told Coleman quietly. "This isn't your ground anymore." Coleman laughed, but it was brittle now. "You think a bunch of bikers scare me?" Jack didn't bother responding. He just turned his head slightly, as if listening to something behind the horizon. A moment later they appeared, first 2, then 5, then a dozen. The first bikes rounded the bend, dust rising behind them in a golden cloud. Sunlight flashed off, chrome and metal, the air thick with gasoline and resolve. The noise wasn't chaotic, it was symphonic, 100 heartbeats syncing to one rhythm. Tires rolled over gravel, engines echoed off the hills, and the road that once felt abandoned was suddenly alive again. Eleanor watched, her hands trembling as the line of riders grew. Some wore helmets painted with old scars, others rode bareheaded, their faces carved by sun and wind and time. They didn't look like heroes, but maybe that was the point. Real heroes don't come polished. They come, scarred, imperfect, carrying the weight of their own failures as proof they know what it costs to lose. Ray was the first to pull up beside Jack. He cut the engine, removed his sunglasses and nodded. "Didn't think you'd ever make that call again." Jack half smiled. "Didn't think I'd have to." Doc parked next to them, his beard catching in the wind. "Same old story, huh? Someone rich forgets how to be human." "Yeah," Jack said, "but maybe they're about to remember." Coleman took a step back, trying to mask his unease with arrogance. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You can't stop this. We have permits, lawyers, contracts." Jack looked around at the line of bikes, the men standing beside them, the dust still hanging in the air like incense. "Then you're going to need more than paper to move us." The foreman muttered to his crew, but no one climbed back into the bulldozers. The shift in mindset was subtle but complete. The workers weren't loyal to Coleman. They were loyal to their own sense of right and wrong, and what they were seeing now stirred something buried under years of silence. Jack turned to Eleanor. "He's not going to touch your house," he said. She shook her head, still dazed by what was unfolding. "Why are you doing this?" Her question wasn't skeptical, it was raw, honest, searching. Jack's answer came without hesitation. "Because someone has to." The road filled with more bikes, their headlights flickering in the dust like candles in a chapel. The air smelled of heat, oil, and change. You could feel it, the slow, steady transformation of fear into courage, of isolation into unity. It wasn't about violence, it was about presence. The kind that makes men in suits realize that money can build walls but can't protect them from the truth. Jack's phone buzzed once more in his pocket, a message from an unknown number, 3 words only, "We're with you." He looked down the line of riders, faces set, engines ready, and something in him softened. Maybe redemption didn't always come through forgiveness. Sometimes it came through action, through the simple decision to stand where no one else would. Eleanor stepped forward, her small frame almost swallowed by the sea of men and machines. She placed her hand gently on Jack's arm. "He would have been proud," she said, her voice trembling. Jack looked at her, then at the porch, then at the bulldozers that hadn't moved since the first roar of engines hit the air. "Then let's make sure his home stands. Long enough to prove it." The sound of engines swelled again, echoing through the valley, carried by wind and resolve. It wasn't just a noise, it was a message, a declaration that justice still had a voice, and sometimes that voice came wrapped in leather and road dust. The sunlight caught the chrome as the riders spread across the road, their presence undeniable. And in that moment, beneath the shadow of power and paper, the tide began to turn, not through speeches or threats, but through the simple, unshakable decision of men who refused to let another good thing be destroyed. The horizon trembled with heat and movement. Coleman's phone buzzed in his pocket, unanswered. The foreman wiped his brow and looked at Jack, then at Eleanor, then at the waiting machines. The day was changing shape, and everyone could feel it. The brotherhood had awakened, and the road, once silent, now carried the heartbeat of something greater than defiance. It carried the sound of humanity remembering itself. The road began to shake before Eleanor saw anything. At first it was faint, a low, rolling tremor under the soles of her shoes, like the heartbeat of the earth waking up after a long sleep. Then came the sound, not the mechanical snarl of bulldozers or the sharp hum of polished engines from the men in suits, but something older, wilder, and deeply human. It rose from the horizon like a storm of thunder and loyalty, the deep harmony of dozens of motorcycles finding rhythm together. Eleanor turned her head toward the road, clutching the porch railing as if the old wood could steady her trembling. She could feel it before she could see it, that unmistakable vibration of power and purpose, of men who weren't coming to talk, but to stand. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice breaking somewhere between fear and disbelief. Jack didn't answer. He simply looked toward the horizon, his face unreadable, but his eyes, they carried something fierce, almost sacred. The first glint of chrome broke through the dust, then another, then 20 more. A long, unbroken line of headlights cut through the haze, each one brighter than the last, until the entire road shimmered with a river of light. The sound grew, rolling over the valley, shaking loose the silence that had settled over the town for too long. Birds took flight from the power lines, the oak trees swayed under the pressure, and even the men in suits stepped back instinctively, like prey sensing the approach of something they couldn't control. Eleanor's breath caught. "Jack, are they yours?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded once. "Ours," he said. That single word carried centuries of meaning, the kind of brotherhood that isn't written down, only lived, tested and earned. The first bikes reached the edge of the property, gravel spraying as tires dug into the dirt. Engines idled low, like growling lions circling their den. One by one, the riders dismounted, leather creaking, boots hitting the ground in perfect sync. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and purpose. Every man carried his own story on his jacket, patches worn thin by years on the road, symbols that didn't need explaining to anyone who'd ever known hardship. Eleanor stood frozen on her porch as the riders formed a semicircle around the house. Some leaned against their bikes, others rested gloved hands on handlebars, but their message was clear before a word was spoken. They weren't leaving, not today, not while injustice was. Parked on her lawn, Coleman's voice cracked when he tried to speak. "This is ridiculous. You think a gang of bikers can stop a lawful order?" He tried to sound confident, but the words fell flat against the roar of machines. Blake tapped frantically on his phone, pretending to record, but his hand was shaking. Jack didn't move. He just watched as his brothers arrived. Ray with his scar catching the sunlight. Doc, old and steady, eyes sharp behind his glasses. Hawk, arms crossed, jaw locked. Tanner, young but hardened, standing shoulder to shoulder with men twice his age. They didn't need introductions. Their presence said everything. The noise softened as the engines idled down, and for a moment it was almost quiet. Dust hung in the air, sunlight slicing through it like divine light breaking through a church window. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was ceremony. Eleanor wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand. She'd been crying so long out of fear that she barely recognized what tears of relief felt like. "They came for me?" she asked softly, voice quivering. Jack turned toward her, his tone calm and grounded. "No," he said. "They came for what's right." Behind him, Ray cracked his knuckles and smirked. "Heard there's a demolition party. Didn't want to miss it." The line got a few quiet laughs, the kind that break tension without disrespecting the gravity of the moment. Even in darkness, there's room for a little light, a reminder that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it grins. Coleman took a step forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "You're interfering with a legal operation," he said, louder this time, trying to sound authoritative. "You'll regret this." Jack didn't flinch. "You've already got what you came for, Coleman. You got your contracts, your signatures, your fancy permits. But what you don't have," he said, pointing to the house behind him, "is her permission." Blake muttered something about calling the sheriff, but Doc's deep voice cut him off before the words finished leaving his mouth. "Call whoever you want, son. We've met sheriffs before. They come, they go, but they don't scare easy men." The tension rippled, electric and alive. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about something larger, the mindset of power meeting the conscience of people who'd lost too much to ever stand by again. The men in suits thought they were facing outlaws. They didn't realize they were facing survivors. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of earth and gasoline. Eleanor stepped off the porch for the first time in hours, her hands still shaking but her back straight. She looked at the line of bikers, strangers moments ago, now a wall between her and the bulldozers. "I prayed for help," she said softly. "Didn't think it would ride up on two wheels." Ray smiled. "Ma'am, sometimes heaven's just out of road." The crew of workers who had been hovering near their machines began exchanging looks. They hadn't signed up for this, not for confrontation, not for something that felt this personal. One of them, a middle-aged man with calloused hands, removed his hard hat and stepped back. Another followed. Slowly, a quiet defection began. Men choosing conscience over command. The human heart has a way of recognizing truth when it's standing right in front of you. Jack looked at the foreman. You can walk away now. No shame in doing what's right. The man hesitated, then nodded, signaling to his crew. One by one, they shut down the engines of the bulldozers. The growl of machines died out, replaced by the hum of motorcycles and the rustle of wind through the fields. The silence that followed was louder than any noise could have been. Coleman's face reddened. You think this is over? He spat. You can't stop progress. You can't stop me. Jack took a slow step closer, voice calm, controlled. Progress, he repeated. That's a word you use when you want to hide a truth behind money. You don't care about progress, Coleman. You care about power. And power without empathy, he paused, eyes locked on him, is just greed with better marketing. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of cooling engines and the whisper of the wind through Eleanor's hair. She looked at Jack, her eyes shining with something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not the kind promised by laws or paperwork, but the kind born from human decency. The riders stood firm, unflinching, a living barricade of loyalty and grit. They didn't look like angels, but they carried something holy in their stance. You could feel it, the transformation of fear into hope, despair into belonging. Eleanor reached out, her hand brushing Jack's arm. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice fragile but full of life. Jack looked at her, then at the line of bikes still gleaming in the sun. You already did, he said. You stayed behind the scenes of that. Dusty standoff, something much bigger was happening. A quiet revelation about what it means to protect, to rebuild, to choose compassion when it costs you something. The men in suits came armed with contracts. The bikers came armed with conscience. And for the first time in a long while, humanity was winning. A gust of wind carried the sound of a flag flapping from one of the bikes, the patch catching sunlight, embroidered words barely visible, no one left behind. Eleanor's gaze followed it, her heart swelling with something close to peace. For years, she'd believed she was forgotten, a relic of a world that moved on too fast. Now, watching that line of engines pulse like living hearts in the dust, she realized she wasn't forgotten at all. She was being remembered, fiercely. The road ahead shimmered in the afternoon light, heat rising from the asphalt like the beginning of a new chapter. And though no one said it out loud, they all felt it. This was more than a stand. It was the start of something that would echo far beyond this small town. The kind of moment that redefines people, rewrites beliefs, reshapes what justice looks like when it's carried not by words, but by action. The roar of engines softened again, steady and low, as if waiting for the next move. Dust settled over chrome and leather, sunlight painting everything gold. The world seemed to hold its breath once more, suspended in that fragile space between what was and what was about to be. The air had thickened into something almost visible, a dense, humming tension that carried the smell of gasoline, hot metal, and defiance. Dust hung suspended between the sun and the earth, as if even time had decided to stop and watch. The bulldozers, enormous and yellow and merciless, idled with a heavy growl that felt more like a threat than a sound. Their engines pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeats of everyone standing on that road, waiting to see who would flinch first. Eleanor stood on her porch, clutching the wooden post, her knuckles white. The house behind her creaked under the weight of the moment, every nail and beam holding its breath. Her old American flag fluttered weakly on the pole, faded but still proud. Across from her, the developers, Coleman and Blake, stood stiff in their pressed suits, their shoes sinking into the dirt that refused to welcome them. Coleman's jaw was tight, his composure slipping inch by inch as he barked something to the foreman. The man nodded, hesitantly, and gave a signal. The bulldozers lurched forward. The movement was slow, almost hesitant, but it was enough. Gravel cracked beneath the treads, and the roar rose louder, mechanical and brutal. Eleanor gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Jack stepped out from the line of bikers, his eyes fixed on the advancing machines. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, didn't posture. He just moved, one deliberate step after another, until he was standing in the center of the road, the dust curling around his boots like smoke. "You want to move that machine," he said, his tone steady as steel. "You'll have to go through all of us." The foreman froze, his hand halfway to the control lever. The other workers exchanged uneasy glances. The bikers behind Jack revved their engines in unison, not wildly, but with precision, a symphony of resistance. The sound wasn't chaos, it was order. It was the sound of men who knew what it meant to hold the line. The bulldozers stopped. For a moment, the only thing moving was the heat rising off the asphalt, rippling like a mirage. The world felt split in two, progress on one side, principle on the other, and Jack stood in the middle, a man-shaped bridge between greed and humanity. Coleman's voice broke the silence. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped, stepping forward. "You're interfering with private development. I have contracts. I have the law on my side." Jack turned his head slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet Coleman's. "You've got paper," he said. "I've got people." Ray stepped up beside him, tattooed arms crossed, his voice like gravel. "And this paper you keep waving around," he said, pointing to the folder in Coleman's hand, "looks like lies printed on expensive ink to me." Coleman laughed nervously, trying to hide the tremor in his hands. "You think you can intimidate me with noise and leather jackets?" Jack didn't answer. He simply gestured to the line of bikes stretching down the road, sunlight glinting off chrome and steel. "This isn't intimidation," he said. "It's presence." The bulldozer operator, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a hard hat that didn't fit quite right, looked from Jack to the porch, then back to the developers. "Sir," he said slowly, "maybe we ought to—" "Keep going," Coleman snapped, his voice sharp and brittle. "We're behind schedule. Do your job." The man hesitated, staring at the house, at Eleanor, trembling but still standing tall, and the patch of land that looked more like memory than property. He'd seen many demolitions, but this one felt wrong, like breaking a promise that didn't belong to him. He looked down at his gloved hands, then cut the engine. The bulldozer sputtered and fell silent. Coleman's face flushed red. "What are you doing? Turn it back on!" The man shook his head. "Not today." Behind him, the other drivers followed suit, one after another, shutting down their machines until the field was quiet again. The noise of the bikers filled the space, deep and unified, like the heartbeat of something ancient. Eleanor's tears rolled freely now, but they weren't from fear. They were from something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Coleman spun on Jack, his voice trembling with fury. "You don't get it, do you? You're not heroes, you're criminals. You can't just stand in the way of progress." Jack tilted his head. "Progress," he repeated, voice soft but dangerous. "Funny word. You use it to mean taking from people who have less just because you can. You want progress? Try building something worth remembering instead of tearing down what already has a soul." The words hung in the air, heavier than the machines that had stopped moving. A distant siren wailed, cutting through the silence like a blade. Blake looked relieved. "Finally," he muttered. Moments later, 2 police cruisers rolled down the road, their lights flashing but sirens fading as they approached the property. The officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts, scanning the scene with uncertainty. Jack didn't move. The bikers didn't move. The officers exchanged glances, visibly torn between duty and instinct. One of them, an older man with lines etched deep into his face, recognized Jack immediately. "Monroe?" he said under his breath. Jack nodded once. "Frank," the officer sighed, lowering his voice. "You again. Last time I saw you, you were pulling people out of a flood on the interstate." "Different storm," Jack said quietly. The officer looked around, at the house, the bulldozers, the old woman clutching a photo on her porch. "You really want me to tell my men to move you?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. The officer rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of decision visible in his eyes. "You're making this hard, Monroe." "Not harder than what they're doing to her," Jack replied. Behind them, the younger officer shifted uncomfortably, hand twitching near his. "Holster." "Sir, this is trespassing. It's private property." The older cop turned on him sharply. "Private property doesn't mean people stop being human, son." Coleman stepped forward, voice raised. "Are you kidding me? Do your job. Arrest them." The officer's gaze moved from the developer's manicured hands to Jack's dirt-streaked gloves. "Looks to me like they're the only ones doing the right job here." The tension cracked, not with violence but with clarity. It was the kind of revelation that hits quietly, when power realizes it's lost its grip because the people it relies on no longer believe in its version of truth. Coleman's voice faltered. He could feel the tide turning and didn't know how to stop it. Jack turned to his brothers. "Hold the line!" Engines revved again, synchronized and thunderous, the air vibrating with defiance. It wasn't just a wall of steel now, it was a living force, an idea in motion. The men stood shoulder to shoulder, their bikes gleaming under the weight of the sun. No one shouted, no one moved. It was the stillness of conviction, the kind of stillness that makes the powerful remember they bleed too. The developers stood there, faces pale, sweating under the heat and the pressure of being seen for what they really were. Not visionaries, not builders, just men who'd mistaken money for morality. Eleanor stepped off the porch, slow but deliberate. Her hands were trembling, but her steps were sure. She walked until she reached Jack's side, her small frame barely reaching his shoulder. She didn't need protection anymore. She just needed to stand. Her voice cracked, but it carried. "You call it progress," she said, looking straight at Coleman, "but all I see is destruction. My husband built this house with his hands, and you think you can erase it with a signature." She paused, her eyes glistening. "You can't erase love. You can't bulldoze memory." No one moved. No one dared to. Even the wind seemed to still itself to listen. Jack placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You've got more courage than all of us combined," he said softly. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I just got tired of being scared." Her words lingered, heavier than the engines, sharper than the law. Something inside the group shifted, not just the bikers, but the workers, the officers, even the bystanders watching from their porches and driveways. You could feel it, the transformation of fear into strength, isolation into unity. The invisible line that divided power from people began to fade. The bulldozers sat idle, silent and harmless now. The only sound that remained was the rhythmic pulse of motorcycles, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The developer's paperwork flapped helplessly in the wind, pages scattering across the dirt, proof that ink, no matter how expensive, couldn't compete with conviction. The officer stepped closer to Jack, his voice quiet but resolute. "You got 5 minutes before the sheriff shows up," he said. Jack gave a single nod. 5 minutes is all we need. And with that, the engines roared again, not as a threat, but as a statement. A chorus of defiance, a wall of sound declaring that justice wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created. Moment by moment, stand by stand. The ground shook, sunlight blazed off metal, and Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound wash over her. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was hope, loud, unyielding, alive. And in that thunder, something deeper was being born. The realization that sometimes the only way to protect what's good in this world is to remind it, loudly, that it's still worth fighting for. The sheriff's car appeared in the distance, sirens silent, lights cutting through the dust. The bikers didn't move and Jack didn't flinch. The road was waiting, the moment suspended, the weight of decision pressing down, ready to tip the scales once and for all. The sheriff's cruiser rolled closer, lights spinning silently. In the dust, and with it came a ripple of curiosity from the town that had been peering through curtains and pretending not to see. People stepped out from porches, phones raised, whispers threading through the heat like nervous birds. Then another sound joined the mix. tires crunching over gravel, doors slamming, the staccato chatter of voices that didn't belong to this road. A white van with a satellite dish climbed the hill, then a second and a third. Local news had arrived, followed by a regional station that seemed to materialize from nowhere, and behind them, a columnist with a camera strapped to her chest and a reporter's notebook that looked more like a weapon than a tool. They moved like a well-practiced troop, tripod down, mic wired, lens cap off, the practiced intensity of people who live on deadlines and breaking stories. The first camera swung toward the line of engines, panning across chrome and leather, stopping on the bulldozers, then landing on Eleanor's house, like it had found the heart of the matter without being told where to look. Eleanor felt the weight of attention and pressed the photo frame harder against her ribs, the glass cool against her skin as if it could steady the tremor in her chest. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not as the center of a conflict where paperwork and memory wrestled in the open air. Her eyes darted from the microphones to the bikers and back again. The presence of the cameras didn't comfort her. It verified that the moment had crossed some invisible line. Private grief had become public story, and stories have their own power. They don't just record impact, they create it. One of the reporters, tall and composed with a practiced half-smile, scanned the scene. Her gaze paused on Jack. The shift in her expression was small, but it carried history. She stepped forward, the mic steady in her hand. "Jack Monroe?" she asked, not like a question, but like a memory being confirmed out loud. "You were in Haverly, weren't you? The flood, the buyout, the relocation." Her voice thinned with recognition. "You were the veteran who tried to keep the community center from closing." Jack's eyes didn't give her much. He stood there like a man who had long ago learned that recognition can turn into spectacle if you feed it. Still, he nodded once. That was a long time ago. The reporter glanced down at her notes, then back at him with a kind of careful respect. "You were decorated," she said. "Silver. Star. Search and rescue. You pulled 3 people from a collapsed bridge, and then Haverly's deal went through. Developers bought out half the town after the flood insurance lapsed. Your father's shop, your sister's place. You didn't fight back then." Her words weren't a dagger, they were a mirror. Behind her even tone, there was a quiet, human question. What changed? Jack's jaw tightened in a way that said the story wasn't an article to him. It was a scar. "I made decisions I thought were smart," he said, voice low, every syllable grounded. "I believed the people in charge would keep their word, and I told myself the fight would cost more than it would save." He let out a breath through his nose. Cost was the wrong metric. The camera held on him. In that lens, the hidden truth of the day began to surface. Something bigger than a property dispute. This wasn't only about a house. It was about a mindset shift, the quiet transformation that happens when a person realizes they can't heal by staying silent. The sheriff stepped out of his cruiser and adjusted his hat, watching the scene gather itself into focus like a picture forming in a dark room. He recognized the math being done on that porch. Past plus present equals a reckoning. Eleanor moved closer to Jack, almost imperceptibly, like a small boat tucking itself into the shadow of a ship. The camera caught it, that instinctive human geometry, one life finding shelter in another's resolve. She looked at the reporter and then at Jack, her voice soft but crisp with clarity. "He didn't have to come," she said, "but he did." Then she turned her hand over and slid her fingers into his. The gesture so gentle, it felt like the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. "You came back for all of us," she whispered. He didn't squeeze her hand. He respected it, honored it. "Maybe I came back for the part of me that should have stood last time," he said. "Maybe both." The reporter's eyes flicked to the Bulldozers, and then to Coleman, whose confidence had curdled into a sheen of sweat beneath the collar. She raised her mic toward him. "Mr. Coleman, there are allegations that signatures were forged and that permits were rushed through without proper notice. Do you have a comment on the integrity of this development?" He snapped back with the brittle certainty of a man who had never been told no. "We followed the law," he said. "Progress isn't a crime." The reporter didn't argue. She simply turned her lens to the shutdown machines, to the workers with their crossed arms and averted eyes, to the officers who had chosen pause over force, and to the road crowded with engines that stood like a new kind of courthouse. Another camera operator swung in close and caught a behind-the-scenes detail most people would miss. Doc slipping a bottle of water into the hand of a nervous bulldozer driver. Ray picking up a stray page of the relocation packet that had blown free and folding it neatly before tucking it back into Eleanor's mailbox. Hawk checking the angle of the bikes, making room for an ambulance if one had to come. The small decisions said more than speeches could. This wasn't theater. It was discipline, a community that understood how to hold a line without breaking it. The sheriff approached Jack, not with aggression, but with the stiff shoulders of a man who knows that the letter of the law sometimes limps behind the spirit. "I've got county supervisors calling me," he said. "I've got a judge who's out fishing and a stack of paperwork I don't trust." Jack nodded. "I've got a deed," he answered, tipping his head toward Eleanor, "and a woman whose name doesn't look right on those copies." The sheriff sighed, long and heavy, his gaze drifting to the cameras, then back. "If I tell them this is a civil dispute, it buys time," he said. "If I tell them it's a safety hazard, it doesn't. They'll send more cars." Jack's voice stayed calm. "Then call it what it is. A community hazard. You push people past the line, you don't get law, you get damage." The sheriff studied him, caught the history behind the words, and nodded once. A small decision that carried large impact. He spoke into his radio, careful with language. The temperature of the day dropped a degree. The lead journalist lowered her mic slightly, watching not as a hunter, but as a witness. "What changed you?" she asked, and the question cooled the dust like a sudden cloud. Jack didn't look at the cameras for permission to answer. He looked at Eleanor, then at the porch, then toward a past that still hummed in his bones. "I did nothing when my father's shop fell," he said. "Told myself it was inevitable. Told myself it wasn't my fight. Told myself I'd only make it worse. That mindset turned into a habit. Habits turn into a life. And the life I was living wasn't the one I could look in the eye." He lifted his chin toward the line of riders. "I thought I'd left this behind. Turns out it was waiting for me to grow up." The word grow hung there, a quiet revelation. It wasn't about anger. It was about maturity, about the journey a man takes from self-protection to responsibility. The cameras didn't blink. They are built not to. But the people holding them changed, just a little. Because some stories don't need narration. They radiate. Coleman saw control leaking from the edges and lunged for the frame of the narrative. "This is manipulation," he said to the reporter, attempting a smile that didn't have a pulse. "A PR stunt by men who like to play hero." The journalist didn't argue. She turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am," she said gently, "what does this house mean to you?" The old woman's eyes warmed with a clarity that made paperwork look like sand. "It's where I remember who I am," she said. "It's where my husband remembered who he wanted to be." She glanced at the porch rail, tracing it lightly. "People think homes are rooms and roofs. They're not. They're the place your promises go to live." The sentence reached out and touched something invisible in the crowd. Even the younger officer who had been restless earlier seemed to soften, as if the word promises had found a door he had been guarding without knowing why. Tanner stepped forward, voice low. "They're not going to touch it," he said, not a threat, but a vow. The journalist's cameraman zoomed in on his face. Young, hard-edged, honest, then widened to catch the bikes in a broad, steady arc, engines idling. Like loyal dogs, the sheriff's radio squawked, an interruption that felt like a test. He listened, nodded, then addressed the developers with the formal neutrality of someone who had decided to pick his footing carefully. "Given the dispute over documentation and the public safety concerns," he said, "we're pausing all demolition until we verify the permits and signatures. No crew crosses that line today." Coleman sputtered, then masked it as outrage. "You can't—" The sheriff raised an open palm. "I just did." News crews recorded it, and with that, the story stretched beyond the valley. The impact multiplied. Somewhere in the city, an editor would assign an op-ed. Somewhere at a breakfast table, a conversation would begin with, "Did you see that?" Interruptions like these, small, local, real, are how culture tilts by degrees. Not all transformations are loud. Some arrive on the back of a patient refusal to obey the inevitable. The reporter took a breath as if bracing for a human question. "Jack," she said softly, "you didn't fight last time. Why risk everything now?" He answered without drama, "Because I learned what regret does when you feed it. It eats your sleep, then it eats your voice, then it eats your decisions. I've got enough ghosts. I'm done making new ones." He looked at Eleanor's porch, the weathered boards that still held steady. "Besides," he added, almost a private confession, "I promised a man I'd try to do better the next time I knew I should." "Stand." The journalist tilted her head. "Your father." Jack's eyes flickered with a memory. "A soldier I didn't know well," he said. "He said courage is just a series of 5-second windows you don't run from. Today had a lot of them." A hush moved through the riders at that. You could tell the sentence fit into some shared code, another patch sewn onto the inside lining where outsiders couldn't see. A behind-the-scenes rulebook that didn't need printing. Show up, hold the line, leave people. Better than you found them. The sun lowered just enough to throw a long stripe of light across the porch, gilding the wood where Daniel had sanded it smooth decades before. Eleanor lifted the photo to that glow and watched the faces within it warm back to life. She turned to Jack, and for a split second she looked like a young woman again, the kind who has one life ending and a new one about to begin. "Thank you," she said, but the words were too small for the shape of the feeling, so she wrapped both hands around his one, her grip stronger than it seemed possible for someone her age. "You came back for all of us." He shook his head, gentle. "We came back," he corrected. "I don't ride alone." The cameras caught Ray's half-smile, Doc's nod, Hawk's watchful stillness. The Brotherhood didn't need applause. They needed outcomes. Small salvations that stacked like bricks into something habitable. A breeze carried the scent of cut grass from a yard that had been mowed earlier in the day before anyone knew the ordinary would be interrupted by revelations. The sheriff checked his watch and spoke into his radio again, quieter this time. The developers gathered a few yards away, their conversation terse, embarrassed, shifting from threats to negotiations, learning, perhaps for the first time, that the ironclad certainty of their plan had a human weather system to contend with. The reporter lowered her mic and looked at Eleanor's house the way you look at a person who just survived a surgery you weren't sure they'd make it through. She wasn't ready to sign off. No one was. The day had turned into a hinge in the town story, and hinges don't announce when they finished their turn. They just keep carrying the door. In the pause that followed, the engines idled like a patient choir. A cloud moved in front of the sun and then passed, throwing a shadow that cooled the ground before letting the light back in. The road ahead did not soften, but it clarified. Verification would be demanded. Paper would be examined, stamps compared, timelines rebuilt. There would be calls, counterclaims, more decisions. But the momentum had shifted. The narrative had tilted toward dignity, and once a story learns how to stand upright, it resists being folded flat. Jack glanced at the sheriff, then at Eleanor, then at the bikes drawn like a line a man could read with his feet. He could feel it, the quiet click of a choice locking into place. Past and present had met in this dust and did not cancel each other. They braided. He breathed in, readying himself not for applause, but for the next necessary thing. As the reporter's earpiece crackled, the cameraman steadied the frame, and the road gathered itself for whatever would arrive when the light changed again. The day after the standoff, the air carried the kind of quiet that only follows storms. Soft, suspended, healing. The sun climbed over the hills slowly, spilling gold across the road where the engines had stood the day before. The dust had settled, but the imprint of tires still marked the earth like the memory of a heartbeat. For the first time in weeks, The sound outside Eleanor's house wasn't the whir of bulldozers or the echo of threats. It was laughter. Word had spread fast. By morning, the quiet town that had once looked away began to arrive, one by one, like pieces of a puzzle finding their place again. Trucks pulled up with wood, nails and tools. A local diner owner brought thermoses of coffee and a tray of biscuits that steamed in the crisp air. Even the sheriff returned, not in uniform, but in an old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, carrying a hammer. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about belonging. Jack stood on the porch steps, one boot on the railing Daniel had built decades ago. He'd been there since dawn, tracing the grain of the wood with his thumb, studying its scars like a story told in splinters. Behind him, Doc was already organizing supplies, muttering under his breath about measurements and proper carpentry, not that mass-produced garbage. Ray hauled planks from the truck bed, tossing one end toward Hawk, who caught it with a grin. Tanner, the youngest, was kneeling near the garden, his gloves caked with dirt as he carefully planted small bursts of color, marigolds, daisies, violets, the kind of flowers that could survive almost anything. Eleanor watched from the porch, her hand resting over her heart. "I don't know how to repay any of you," she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady, alive in a way they hadn't been in years. Jack looked at her, his tone quiet but certain. "You already did. You stood your ground when everyone else forgot they had one." There was no grand speech, no formal declaration of victory. It was quieter than that, more sacred. The developers had left without ceremony. Coleman's car had sped off the previous evening after a final, frustrated call with his legal team, who likely advised him that fighting a community backed by both evidence and sympathy was suicide for his career. Blake had followed, his designer shoes collecting the dust he'd once looked down on. They left their permits behind, now worthless paper scattered in the dirt. What remained was something money couldn't buy, people rediscovering each other. Neighbors who had pretended not to notice the demolition notices now came with paintbrushes, food, and tears. An old man from 3 streets over who hadn't spoken to Eleanor in years after a petty dispute about a fence line showed up with a power drill and an apology. "Guess we both had better things to fight about," he said, and she laughed, the kind of laugh that sounds like forgiveness. The news vans were gone by midday, leaving behind a few curious headlines and one viral clip. Jack standing before the bulldozers saying, "You want to move that machine? You'll have to go through all of us." The video spread fast, not because it was sensational, but because it felt true. People saw something in it they'd been missing, raw, unpolished decency. It wasn't just rebellion, it was restoration. The impact rippled far beyond the town's borders. Donations began to pour in from strangers who said the story reminded them of something they'd lost faith in, humanity itself. Jack didn't pay attention to the headlines. He wasn't built for cameras. But that evening, as the sun began to set and the last nails went into the new porch, he caught his reflection in the key. Window pane, a tired face, a healed one. He wasn't sure if redemption looked like forgiveness or just a good day's work, but this felt close enough. Doc leaned against a post, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You ever think we'd be out here fixing porches instead of raising hell?" he asked. Jack smirked. "Maybe this is what raising hell's supposed to look like." Ray chuckled from behind them. "Never thought justice would smell like fresh paint." Eleanor stepped out with lemonade in a glass. Pitcher, her floral apron fluttering in the wind. "You boys work faster than the county ever did," she said. Tanner straightened up from the garden, brushing dirt off his jeans. "That's because we don't bill by the hour, ma'am," he said with a grin. She laughed again, the kind of laugh that builds a bridge between generations. It wasn't just a repair, it was a transformation. Each hammer strike seemed to echo with meaning, every brush of paint a quiet rebellion against indifference. Behind the scenes, the town was learning something essential, that justice wasn't a single act, it was a mindset. It wasn't always about laws or verdicts. Sometimes it was about hands, sweat, and showing up when it mattered. The sheriff came by near sunset, leaning on his truck door, watching them work. "Never thought I'd see this place come alive again," he said. Jack shrugged, eyes still on the boards he was nailing down. "It was never dead," he said, "just waiting for someone to remember it mattered." The sheriff nodded. "You planning to stay in town?" Jack paused, his hammer midair. "Not sure," he said honestly. "Road's always been home, but I'll stick around till it's right." The sheriff smirked. "You sound like a man who's already staying." Jack didn't argue. By the time the stars began to show, the porch was finished. It looked new, but not perfect, exactly as it should. A mix of old and new wood, each piece telling its own part of the story. The flower beds bloomed faintly in the twilight, catching the last traces of gold from the dying sun. The wind shifted through the fields, carrying the low, distant hum of engines. Some heading home, some just driving without destination. Eleanor stood by the doorway, looking out over her yard. "He'd have loved this," she said quietly, referring to her husband. "He always said a home's not about walls. It's about the people who'd fight to keep it standing." Jack leaned on the railing beside her. "Then I guess you were right all along," he said. "You're not alone." Her eyes softened. "None of us are," she whispered. For a long time, no one spoke. The world didn't need words, it just needed stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when a story has reached the part where pain and purpose finally meet. The night was gentle, the stars bright, and the engines silent for the first time in days. But under that peace, something else stirred, an awareness that this wasn't the end. It was never just about one house, it was about what happens. And next, about all the other Eleanors, all the forgotten corners of towns where power hides behind signatures and progress wears a smile too sharp to trust. Jack felt it deep in his chest, a quiet calling that sounded a lot like responsibility. Ray must have sensed it too. "You think this is it?" he asked. Jack looked at him. "You ever know it to be?" Ray chuckled, shaking his head. "Didn't think so." Doc tightened the last bolt on the porch rail and stood, stretching his back. "Well, if there's more of this kind of trouble waiting out there, I suppose we'll find it," he said. Jack didn't disagree. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his old lighter, and flicked it open. The tiny flame reflected in his eyes, small but steady, the kind of light that survives storms. "Sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge," he said softly, almost to himself. "Sometimes it rides a Harley." Eleanor smiled, watching the men she once saw as strangers now blend seamlessly into the life she'd thought she'd lost. "Then may the road never end for men like you," she said. The light on the porch flickered to life, warm and golden, chasing away the last shadows from the day before. The house stood tall again, not as a monument, but as a reminder. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, roots deep, unshaken. The town, once quiet and afraid, had found its heartbeat again. And somewhere out on the edge of that horizon, where asphalt meets twilight and stories begin to repeat themselves in new forms, the low growl of an engine started once more, soft, purposeful, carrying the echo of what had been done and the promise of what was still to come. The sound drifted toward the road, not as an ending, but as the beginning of another journey, one paved with courage, compassion, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to be announced to be understood. The next morning arrived wrapped in a gentle mist, the kind that softens the edges of everything and makes even the scars on the road look like part of a painting. The world had shifted in small, quiet ways, not through fireworks or headlines, but through presence, through the kind of human decency that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. The smell of freshly cut wood still lingered around Eleanor's house, mingling with the sweetness of new paint and blooming marigolds. The porch, once cracked and fading, now stood strong again, catching the light like it had been waiting for this day all along. Eleanor stepped outside slowly, her bare feet brushing against the wooden boards. The morning light kissed her face, and she breathed deeply, letting the air fill her chest like a prayer answered in slow motion. She could still hear the faint echo of engines in her mind, the rhythm of brotherhood that had arrived when everything seemed lost. The sound had left an imprint on her, not of noise, but of courage. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of silence. Jack stood by his bike at the end of the dirt path, the rising sun glinting off the metal and turning the air around him gold. His jacket was draped over the seat, the same one worn thin by miles and mistakes, the same one that had weathered storms across more states than he could count. He was checking his chain, tightening a bolt, small rituals for a man who lived by the road's rhythm. But there was something different about the way he moved this time. It wasn't restlessness. It was calm, the kind that comes after finally putting down a burden you didn't realize you'd been carrying. Eleanor watched him for a moment before calling out, "You're really leaving?" Her voice carried across the quiet yard, soft but certain. Jack looked up, meeting her eyes with a half-smile that felt like sunlight breaking through cloud. "Road's calling," he said. "It always does." She nodded, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps, the hem of her dress brushing against the grass. "Then let me at least thank you properly," she said. "You didn't just save my home. You reminded this town it still had a soul." Jack chuckled, the sound low and honest. "Wasn't just me," he said. "It was everyone who showed up when they could have stayed home. I just lit the spark." He looked toward the porch, where the fresh paint still gleamed under the light. "Your husband built this place with his hands. I guess it was only right that a few more hands helped keep it standing." She smiled, tears welling, but not falling. "He would have liked you," she said quietly. Jack tilted his head, curious. "You think so?" She nodded. He had that same stubborn kindness, the kind that hides under rough edges. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Most people just see the edges." Eleanor reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small object, a tarnished silver key on a weathered chain. "He used to carry this when he worked on the house," she said. "Said it was his reminder that doors can always be rebuilt, even the ones the world locks on you." She placed it in Jack's hand, her fingers closing around his. "You'll find a door worth opening again. I just know it." Jack looked down at the key, then back at her. For a man who had seen war, loss, and too much of the world's indifference, this small act of trust carried more weight than he was ready for. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But I think you already opened it." Behind them, the rest of the crew began to gather near their bikes. Doc was the first to speak, breaking the spell. "If we don't hit the highway soon, the sun'll have us for breakfast," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Ray grinned, kicking the stand off his Harley. "You afraid of a little heat, old man?" "No," Doc shot back. "I just like my leather not glued to my skin." The exchange drew a small laugh from Eleanor, and even Jack couldn't help but smile. It was the kind of easy banter that only existed between men who'd seen too much to take life too seriously. Tanner gave Eleanor a nod as he adjusted his helmet. "The flowers'll bloom fine," he said. "You just keep talking to 'em like you did us." She placed a hand over her heart. "Oh, I will," she said. "But don't think you're off the hook. I expect to see those bikes come back down this road sometime." Ray revved his engine. "You make pie, and we'll think about it," he said. Eleanor laughed again, a real, full sound this time, and Jack could see how different it was from the woman he'd first met, trembling on her porch, holding a picture to her chest. That version of her had been cornered by the world. This one stood in the open, unafraid, her feet planted in the soil of everything she'd fought to keep. That was the hidden truth of what happened here. It wasn't just about saving a house. It was about transformation, about what happens when people remember their power and decide to use it. Jack put on his jacket and swung his leg over the bike. The key she'd given him rested in his pocket, a small weight with big meaning. He pulled on his gloves, adjusting them with care, the leather creasing like old skin. He looked back at Eleanor one more time, her white hair shining in the sun like silver. "You'll be all right," he said. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with that unshakable mix of faith and defiance. "I already am." The engines roared to life one by one. a chorus of sound that rolled across the valley like thunder blessed by the sky itself. Dust rose around the tires, catching the light and turning the morning into something almost cinematic. The townspeople who had gathered at the edges of the road waved as the bikes began to move, their faces bright with gratitude and awe. Some filmed it, some simply watched, but all of them felt it. They were witnessing something rare. Decency in motion, the quiet power of people choosing to care when it's easier not to. Eleanor stepped onto the road and lifted her hand, her smile wide and steady as the line of riders passed her one by one. Jack was last, as always. He slowed the bike as he came near, looking at her through the dust and morning light. She raised her hand higher, and he nodded once in return, a silent promise that said more than words could. Then he turned the throttle, and the engine's growl deepened, carrying him forward into the long stretch of open road ahead. The sound faded gradually, replaced by the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. Eleanor stood there a while longer, watching the horizon, where the riders disappeared until the silence became peace. She turned back toward her home, the porch now sturdy beneath her feet, the marigolds dancing in the breeze like small flames that refused to go out. And somewhere far down that same highway, Jack glanced at the mirror just long enough to see the small figure of the woman waving fade into the landscape. He didn't slow down. He didn't need to. The road ahead wasn't empty anymore. It was full of purpose, of people worth standing, or of stories that still needed their endings rewritten. The kind of road that keeps teaching you, mile after mile, that redemption isn't a destination. It's a decision you keep making, one choice at a time. He rode with the sun behind him, casting long shadows that stretched out across the asphalt like reminders of where he'd been. The key around his neck clinked softly against the zipper of his jacket, each sound like a heartbeat, a rhythm that felt almost sacred. He didn't have a map, and he didn't need one. Some journeys don't require directions, they just ask that you keep moving forward. And as the day grew brighter and the horizon opened wide, his voice came through in the soft hum of a thought carried on the wind, a whisper that belonged not just to him, but to anyone who's ever lost faith and found it again through someone else's courage. "Maybe the world's still cruel," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the endless road ahead. "But it's not hopeless. Not while hearts like hers still stand, and not while hearts like ours still ride." The line of motorcycles shimmered in the distance, growing smaller until they became one with the horizon, a living symbol of what it means to keep believing, even when the world tries to take that belief away. And in the town they left behind, the porch lights stayed on long after sunset, glowing warm against the dark, as if promising that the story somehow wasn't over yet. Funny how some stories stay with you long after the engines fade, isn't it? Maybe it's not just about what happened out there on that dusty road. Maybe it's about what it reminds us of, that decency still exists, that compassion still roars louder than greed when someone dares to start the engine first. If you felt that too, if something in this story struck a chord or made you pause for a second, leave me a comment below with the words, "I'm with you until the end." I'd love to know how far this road reached today. And hey, give this video a like if it left something good in you. It helps the story travel further, helps more people find a bit of that same hope we just rode through together. If you're new here, or maybe you've been quietly watching from the sidelines, consider subscribing. That's how we keep this circle alive. One story at a time, one reminder that the world's still worth believing in. There's another video right here that dives into a story just as powerful, one that echoes this same heartbeat of justice and compassion. Click it and keep riding with me there. The road's still open.